The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Godric's Hollow, years ago. 2 cribs stood in the nursery that night, side by side beneath the same window, a detail almost no one beyond the cottage walls was aware of. The front gate clicked open, and no footsteps followed it. That absence alone told James Potter everything he needed to know. He shouted up the stairs to Lily, "Take them and go," then turned toward the door, wand half raised. Already certain he wouldn't have nearly enough time to matter. What came through the door did not negotiate. James fell quickly, and the house went quiet in the specific way houses go quiet after something irreversible. Upstairs, Lily reached the nursery with seconds to spare and used every one of them standing between her sons and the stairs. Harry slept on the left, one fist closed around nothing. Julian, on the right, was awake, watching the door. She didn't get the chance to finish being afraid. The curse took her, and then it crossed the room toward the crib nearer the door, toward Julian, simply because he was closer, and panic does not consult prophecy on points of detail. What happened in the next several seconds was never recorded correctly by anyone who survived to write it down. The curse met something it didn't expect over that crib. 2 magical signatures freshly separated from a single shared core, the boundary between them still soft, not yet fully healed. Instead of rebounding cleanly, the curse tore through the thin membrane between both children on its way back to its caster. Something came loose in that tearing, and it did not return to the wand it left from. A fragment of it stayed behind, and it did not stay where it had been aimed. The ceiling above the cribs, already weakened by the force of the attack, gave way along an old beam. A piece of falling plaster caught Julian above the left eye, opening a thin cut that would scar in the shape of a lightning bolt. He cried out, the first sound either twin made that night, and the sound that would shape the next decade. Harry didn't wake. The loose fragment found him in his sleep instead, and his body absorbed it the way a child absorbs a fever, without understanding, without a mark to show for it. In the wreckage downstairs, there was no longer a man standing where one had been a minute before. Only robes, settling. Hagrid arrived first and did exactly what kindness does under pressure. He reached for the version of events that made sense fastest. A screaming infant with a fresh, prophecy-shaped wound. A second infant, silent, untouched. He lifted Julian out of the rubble and would have sworn honestly that he'd done the right thing. Sirius Black arrived minutes later and asked where Harry was before he'd finished getting off the motorbike. Hagrid told him, kindly, that Harry hadn't got a scratch on him, meant as good news. For one terrible second, Sirius nearly let himself hear it that way. Then he went inside, found what was left of James and Lily, and picked Harry up out of the second crib with hands that had gone numb for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. By the time Albus Dumbledore arrived, the story had already calcified. He knelt by Julian's crib, looked at the cut above his eye, and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "It's him." The mark proves it. He didn't ask which twin had been closer to the door. Within days, the full truth of that night reached the Ministry through trace spells run over the ruined cottage, the same kind of residual magic sweep used in any suspicious death. It surfaced Peter Pettigrew's name almost immediately, the Potters' supposed protector, secretly working for the other side, the one who'd given up their location. Pettigrew fled before he could be questioned and was never seen again. Sirius, who'd been wrongly suspected for less than a full day before the spell residue cleared him, walked free, grieving, furious, and entirely unwatched by a Ministry already satisfied it had its villain. He had no proof that the wrong child had been marked. Only a held breath, and a boy who hadn't woken up screaming when, by every account, he should have. It wasn't enough to argue with Albus Dumbledore on the worst night of the man's life. It was enough to start wondering. Dumbledore's certainty was not malice. That was the part Sirius found hardest to hold on to in the weeks that followed. lying awake in a flat he could no longer afford to keep, in a borrowed silence he hadn't asked for. Dumbledore had spent 18 months bracing for a prophecy he half believed and entirely feared, and when a scar arrived in the exact shape his dread had already drawn, certainty closed the case before the case had finished happening. It was, Sirius thought, the oldest and gentlest and most dangerous habit a brilliant man could carry. The conviction that being right the first time excused him from checking twice. There was no inquest into which twin had actually been nearer the curse, because nobody thought to ask. There was no examination of Harry beyond a healer's brief confirmation that he was, physically, unharmed. That word did a great deal of quiet work that month, standing in for a thoroughness nobody actually performed. Sirius went to the ministry once, in November, with nothing more than a feeling and no language yet for what the feeling meant. He asked, carefully, whether anyone had checked both children for any lingering magical residue, the way you might check a wound for infection. The healer he spoke to was kind, tired, and entirely unconvinced. Julian Potter's case was already a closed door with a brass plaque on it, and nobody in that office had any appetite to reopen a door the whole wizarding world had already walked through and decorated. He didn't push further. He had a 1-year-old to raise and a war's aftermath to live inside, and he understood, even then, that some truths only survive being carried quietly, for a long time, before anyone is ready to hear them. Potter Manor had been empty for 30 years when Sirius found the deed buried in a Gringotts vault nobody had sent statements to in a generation. James had never mentioned it, because James had never thought of it as his, a house his grandfather built and his father walked away from in favor of something smaller and warmer. The wards recognized the blood in 1-year-old Harry's veins before they recognized anything about the man carrying him. Sirius didn't clean the dust that first day. He stood in the front hall and told the house, out loud, that it was just the two of them now. It wasn't quite true yet. He meant to make it true. He found Lily's notes that autumn, in a trunk he'd been avoiding. A slim notebook with no title, just a date and a line beneath it. Muggle-born children show magical potential years before Hogwarts notices. Someone should be looking earlier. I am going to start. 5 names in the notebook were crossed out, with notes in the margins about families who'd moved or stopped believing her. The 6th had no line through it. Hermione Granger. Born 19 September 1979. Reorganized a waiting room by publication date for fun. Watch this one. Sirius found the Grangers 4 years later in a Crawley sitting room, where a small girl was sorting a stack of library books by a system her parents had given up trying to follow. He introduced himself honestly enough, a family friend, someone interested in her education, and simply started visiting, bringing books older and stranger than anything in the local library. He never needed to take her anywhere. She came to him through the books themselves, faster than he could keep up with. By the time Harry was 7 and Hermione was 7.5, Sirius brought them together in the Manor's East Library, because he'd run out of ways to explain magical theory to a child who absorbed it quicker than he could speak it. Hermione looked at 3 centuries of uncatalogued correspondence and announced, without introducing herself first, that it was going to take her a while to sort. It took her 4 years. Harry, who had never met anyone his own age who understood what he was doing with his hands when he practiced wandless charms in the garden, decided privately that this was the first person who frightened him a little, in a way he liked. The training itself was never cruel, and Sirius was careful to keep it that way. No schedules, no marks for failure, just a house full of time, and 2 children who'd decided that understanding things was more interesting than almost anything else available to them. Harry managed wandless lumos at 8 because Hermione asked him to try something while reading a theory text on intent. And it worked, and neither of them treated it as remarkable, which is exactly why it became remarkable later. Sirius explained the scar to Harry properly only once, the night Harry found an old clipping he hadn't been looking for. The boy who lived, Julian Potter, 3 months old, survives the killing curse. A photograph of a baby with a thin scar held up like a trophy that hadn't learned to object yet. "That's my brother," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "There are two kinds of marks," Sirius told him. "The one everyone can see, that's his. A story people can point at. And there's the kind nobody can see at all. That one's yours." He didn't explain everything that night. Not the fragment, not the full shape of it. Harry was still young. But he told him enough. Being unknown isn't a punishment. It's the only reason you've had years to actually become something, instead of years spent performing it for people who'd clap whether you'd earned it or not. Harry sat with that for a long while after Sirius had gone to bed, the clippings still folded on the table in front of him, turning the idea over the way Hermione had taught him to turn over any new piece of information, slowly, from several angles, before deciding what to do with it. He didn't feel envy, exactly, looking at the photograph of his brother. He felt something closer to curiosity about a stranger who happened to share his face, and a quiet, settled certainty that whatever that stranger's life looked like, from the outside, his own was the one he'd have chosen, given the choice. By the time Harry was approaching his 11th birthday, the difference between the two boys had become impossible to ignore on paper, even if no one outside the manor had any paper to look at. A small item ran in the Daily Prophet about Julian disappointing an audience at a ministry showcase, unable to produce so much as a spark on command. The same week, in the manor's training yard, Harry executed a layered shield and redirect working that Hermione's research said shouldn't be possible before Hogwarts at all. Not because it was hard the way a difficult sum is hard, but because it required a degree of control nobody expects from a child. Sirius set the newspaper down beside Hermione's notebook, where she'd recorded the exact angle of Harry's redirected stunner in small, precise handwriting, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The 2 pages sitting side by side said everything 10 years had been quietly building toward. The Grangers by then had stopped asking where the books came from, and started simply making room on the shelves. Mr. Granger, a dentist with a tidy, ordered mine that suited his daughters better than either of them probably realized, had taken to calling Sirius the tutor with a fondness that assumed, not unreasonably, that this was some kind of scholarship arrangement nobody had bothered to put in writing. Mrs. Granger worried, in the specific quiet way of a mother watching her daughter outgrow a world she couldn't follow her into, but she worried less with every year that passed without anything going visibly wrong. "She's going to a school for it, then," Mr. Granger said. The September the letters finally arrived, 2 creamy envelopes, addressed in green ink, to 2 different houses that didn't know about each other yet. "About time, frankly, she's been running circles around every school we've put her in since she was 4. She's going to a very good one," Sirius said, which was true, and left out the part where he'd known exactly which school for 9 years. Diagon Alley that August was the first time Harry and Hermione walked anywhere together in public without either of them needing to be careful about it, a small, ordinary freedom that neither of them had words for at the time, though Hermione wrote about it anyway. 3 lines and a margin she never showed anyone. "First time either of us has been somewhere crowded and unremarkable. I would like more days like this one." They bought wands on the same afternoon, in the same dim shop smelling of old wood and feathers, from a man with pale, measuring eyes who took an unusually long time with both of them and said, of Harry's in particular, that it was a curious thing, a wand that seemed to be waiting for him to grow into it, rather than the other way around. Sirius didn't mention the prophecy, the fragment, any of it. He simply paid, and thanked the man, and didn't ask what curious meant, because some answers were better left for later years to supply on their own. The training, in those final months before September, sharpened without ever losing its patience. Sirius brought in a retired dueling instructor twice a month, an old friend of James's from his own Hogwarts years, sworn to discretion with a vow Hermione had insisted on drafting herself, line by line, after reading 3 different texts on binding oaths the week before his first visit. The instructor never asked why a manor nobody officially lived in needed a dueling tutor for 2 children nobody officially knew about. He simply taught, and was paid well, and kept his mouth shut, the way men of his generation had learned to do about a great many things during the war. By the final week of August, Hermione had read every book in the East Library twice, and started a second pass, annotating her own first set of margin notes, a habit Sirius found equal parts alarming and reassuring. Harry, for his part, had stopped needing to think before casting almost anything Sirius or the instructor put in front of him, not because the magic came without effort, but because the effort had become so familiar, it no longer announced itself as effort at all. "You're going to walk into that school," Sirius told them both the night before they left, "and almost nobody in it is going to have any idea what either of you can actually do. That's not an accident. That's the whole point of the last 10 years. Don't waste it by showing off in the first week." "We weren't planning to," Hermione said, faintly offended at the suggestion. "I know," Sirius said. "I'm telling you anyway, because it's the kind of thing a parent's meant to say, and I'd like the chance to say at least one of those properly before you're gone." He stood at the gate the next morning longer than either of them noticed, watching the carriage that would take them to the station disappear down the lane, and found himself thinking, not for the first time, about a version of this morning that had never happened. Lily fussing over a scarf, James making some joke about house points that would have embarrassed everyone involved. Both of them very much alive to see their son off to school the ordinary way, surrounded by noise and chaos and absolutely no need for secrecy at all. He let himself have the thought for exactly as long as it took to walk back into the house, and then he put it away. The way he'd learned to put away most things that didn't help him do the next necessary thing. The years leading up to that morning had not been easy in any of the ways easy usually means. There had been a winter, when Harry was 6, when a fever had taken hold of him for 3 days running, and no healer Sirius trusted enough to call would explain why a child raised on careful magical theory kept dreaming, in his sleep, of a cold he couldn't name. Sirius had sat up 3 nights in a row beside the bed, more frightened than he'd let either child see, until the fever broke on its own, and Harry woke asking, perfectly calmly, why his dreams had felt like someone else's. Sirius hadn't had an answer then. He filed the question away with all the others he didn't yet have language for, and didn't bring it up again until Hermione's research, years later, finally gave the dream a name. There had been good years too, far more of them than hard ones, summers spent teaching both children to swim in the manor's lake, badly, with more laughing than instruction. A Christmas when Hermione's parents came to stay for 3 days, and Mr. Granger spent the entire visit trying, without success, to beat Sirius at chess, an afternoon when 9-year-old Harry, frustrated past patience with a runic exercise Hermione had set him, finally got it right and ran the length of the library shouting about it loudly enough that the portraits complained for a week. Sirius kept all of it the way a man keeps things he isn't sure he's earned. Carefully, gratefully, without quite trusting that it would last. Once, when Harry was 8, Sirius took him to a small ministry-sponsored fair in a village 2 towns over, far enough from anywhere recognizable that the risk felt manageable, and the 2 of them stood at the edge of a crowd, watching a much younger Julian, perhaps 6 at the time, perform a scripted demonstration of beginner wand work for an audience that clapped before he'd finished the spell. Simply because of who he was. Harry watched without saying much, and Sirius watched Harry, trying to gauge whether the moment was landing as envy or something else entirely. "Do you want that?" Sirius asked carefully, on the walk back to the apparition point. The crowd, the clapping. Harry thought about it for longer than Sirius expected. "I don't think I want people to clap for me," he said finally. "I think I want to be good at something and have it actually matter, even if nobody's watching when it does." Sirius didn't say anything for a moment, and then put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, the way he did when words felt insufficient for what he meant. "That's the harder thing to want," he said. "Most people never figure out that's the better one until they're a great deal older than 8. Julian arrived at the platform with an entourage that had nothing to do with family, a ministry liaison, well-wishers who'd been waiting since dawn, a wave he'd been taught to give. Harry and Hermione walked on 3 carriages back, and nobody turned to look, because nobody outside this story knew there was a second name to look for. "They don't know," Hermione said. "They know there's a Potter," Harry said. "They just haven't worked out there are 2 of us yet." The train ride sorted its own small trouble without either of them performing it. Down one corridor, a frightened first-year's trunk had spilled open under a prefect's officious scolding. Harry righted it and closed the latch with a quiet, wandless charm before anyone thought to ask his name. 3 carriages forward, Julian's owl worked its cage door loose and bolted shrieking down the corridor. Julian's attempt to calm it with a clumsy levitation charm only flung the bird sideways into a luggage rack. Harry, passing the doorway once, let his attention brush the owl for half a second and released a calming charm into the air around it. It stopped shrieking mid-flap and settled as though it had meant to land there all along. Julian's friends told him his second attempt had worked. He believed them, because believing them was easier than wondering why the bird had calmed a full beat before he raised his wand. "You're going to keep doing that," Hermione said, when Harry returned to their compartment. "Probably. I'll manage what people know," she said. "You manage what they don't need to." It was, neither of them realized yet, the exact division of labor that would define the next 7 years. The Great Hall, that evening, sorted its way through the alphabet the way it always had, indifferent to whatever noise the rest of the room made about any of it. Harry and Hermione sat together near the back of the gathered first years, close enough to watch the staff table, far enough to avoid being looked at first. The sorting hat took its time with both of them. For Hermione, it weighed ambition against the specific shape of how she wanted to use what she knew. Not for herself alone, but as architecture, as quiet correction of things built wrong. And set her in Ravenclaw, with a murmur that Slytherin would have made her nervous from across the hall regardless, and that her courage had very nearly tipped the scales the other way. For Harry, it turned over something it hadn't encountered cleanly in a long time. There's something in you that doesn't belong to you originally, and you've built around it rather than letting it build you. That's rarer than the power itself. It considered Slytherin, considered the quiet exercise of ambition without applause, and set him in Ravenclaw beside his friend instead. I imagine that's not a coincidence either of you will need explained to you. Harry took his seat 3 tables away from a brother who was still trying to work out why everyone kept saying his name like there was a second version of it loose in the hall that night. The first weeks of term settled into a rhythm neither of them had to work very hard at. Classes that delighted the rest of their year. The first shaky Wingardium Leviosa. The first nervous approach to a live plant in herbology were, for Harry and Hermione, mostly an exercise in looking appropriately surprised by things they had already mastered years earlier in a quiet manor library. Professor Flitwick, marking Hermione's first practical charms essay, wrote a single line in the margin, "Where did you learn to phrase a containment principle this cleanly?" She wrote back, politely, that she read a great deal, which was true, and left out the part where most of what she'd read wasn't taught at Hogwarts at all. They made a third occasional friend that autumn, Neville Longbottom, a round-faced, anxious boy 2 years above them in confidence and several years below them in self-assurance, who lost his toad with a regularity that became, eventually, a kind of running joke between the 3 of them. Harry liked him for reasons he didn't examine too closely at first and eventually understood plainly enough. Neville never once asked Harry to be impressive. He simply wanted help finding Trevor, and was grateful, plainly and without performance, when he got it. "You're kind to him," Hermione said once, watching Harry walk Neville back from yet another failed toad search. "He's kind to me," Harry said. "He's the only person in this school who's never once wanted anything from me except help finding an amphibian. That's restful. In a way you wouldn't believe until you've had the opposite for a few weeks." By October, the 3rd-floor corridor had become the school's favorite rumor. Ever since Dumbledore announced, with theatrical weight that didn't quite hide real fear, that it was forbidden to anyone who didn't wish to die a painful death. "That's not a joke," Hermione said. "That's a label on a door." It took her 3 weeks of careful library work to trace the warning to its source, Nicholas Flamel, 465 years old, and the single object that had kept him alive that long. The Philosopher's Stone, hidden inside the school. "Or someone thinks it's bait," Harry said. "If you wanted to draw something dangerous into a building full of children, you put something at once behind a door everyone's told not to open." They settled quickly on Professor Quirrell, a stammer too consistent to be nerves. A turban worn in every weather, a wrongness in the air around him that had nothing to do with temperature. Harry felt it directly. In a way his vocabulary didn't have words for yet. Not a ghost riding a man, but something larger and worse. Sustained rather than separate. The greater part of whatever remained of Voldemort, kept alive on borrowed strength, waiting for its chance at the stone. "It's not riding him the way the old stories describe possession," Harry told Hermione, after the 3rd time he'd felt it in a corridor. "It's not a passenger. It's closer to, most of a person, living somewhere it shouldn't still be able to live, using Quirrell as the only body left available to it." Hermione spent 4 careful days turning that description into something closer to theory. Cross-referencing it against the oldest texts the restricted section would let her near. What she settled on was unglamorous but solid. Whatever had survived the curse's rebound 13 years earlier hadn't died with the body it lost that night. It had simply gone looking for somewhere else to exist, the way smoke looks for any room with an open window. "That means there's more of him in Quirrell than there ever was in that diary you're going to find next year," she said, before either of them knew yet that there would be a diary at all. "Whatever's loose in this castle right now isn't a fragment. It's the man, mostly, minus a body of his own." They didn't wait for the school year the rumor mill expected. On the night of the 23rd of September, they went through a service passage Hermione had mapped from old castle blueprints, past a 3-headed dog lulled asleep by a charmed harp, past a patch of devil's snare that recoiled from wand light before it could close around them, past a chess set Hermione solved in 11 moves because she'd had the luxury of working it out 2 nights early. Instead of surviving it blind, past a flock of enchanted keys that took Harry nearly 4 minutes of patient, cold-fingered searching to sort through before his hand finally closed around the one with the bent silver wing. In the final chamber stood a tall, gold-framed mirror and a sleeping troll someone else had clearly already passed and left behind. Evidence, Harry noted, that Quirrell had been testing these defenses alone, in the dark, learning their shape the way a man learns a lock before he tries the key. That detail unsettled Hermione more than the troll itself did. "He's further along than we thought," she said. "Then we're exactly on time," Harry said, "and not a day early." The mirror showed Harry his parents, warm and moving and looking out at him as if they'd been waiting. It would have been easy to stay there wanting nothing else. That was, Hermione would note later, exactly the obstacle's design, not a test of skill, but of whether desire alone could make someone stop, content with an image, instead of finishing what they came to do. Harry felt his reflection's pocket grow heavier once, the stone settling into existence there, the mirror's signal that it had decided he'd leave it behind, rather than use it. He stepped back before the glass could finish whatever sentence his parents were building toward. "It's not really there," he told Hermione. "It only gives it to someone who'd walk away from it anyway." It took them another hour to extract the real stone from Flamel's actual storage method, working from a containment charm Hermione adapted on the spot. By 2 a.m, the stone, small, plain, disappointing for something that had bought 4 centuries of life, sat wrapped in cloth in her pocket. They left it on Dumbledore's desk in a sealed box. With a single unsigned note, "The corridor is empty now. Whoever was coming for this will need a new plan. So will you." Dumbledore, once he'd recovered from the shock of finding it there at all, arranged quietly to return the stone to Flamel and his wife with no public record of how close it had come to being lost. a courtesy the old alchemist apparently appreciated enough to send. The following spring, a small, unmarked parcel to the manor containing nothing but a short, handwritten note. Thank you, whoever you are, for understanding that some things are worth letting end naturally rather than being stretched past their proper hour. I intend to take the advice myself. Eventually, Hermione kept the note in the same notebook section as everything else neither of them could explain to anyone outside the manor. Dumbledore found it the next morning, 3 days before Quirrell. Pale, agitated, his plans collapsed without explanation, even attempted his next move. The old wizard sat with the box for a long while, in a silence that had nothing to do with relief. For the first time since October of 1981, he had proof that someone else had been operating in his castle more carefully than he had, and no idea who. Quirrell's reaction, when he finally did descend toward the 3rd floor and found the corridor's defenses already disturbed and the chamber beyond it empty, was not the fury Harry half expected to feel echo of in the days that followed. It was something closer to confusion, curdling slowly into dread. The dawning understanding that whatever had taken the stone had done so not through brute force, but through a competence that implied someone else in this castle understood exactly what was at stake, and had chosen, for reasons he couldn't begin to guess at, not to confront him directly about it. He grew paler over the following weeks, his stammer worsening rather than easing, and twice Harry caught him watching the Ravenclaw table at dinner, with an expression that looked less like suspicion and more like a man trying to work out which of several hundred students might be responsible for ending his plans without ever once announcing himself. He never settled on an answer. By the end of the spring term, with no stone left to chase and no explanation forthcoming, the wrongness Harry had tracked all year seemed to retreat into something smaller and more careful, content for the moment to wait, rather than risk exposure twice in the same year. Harry noted the change and said nothing about it to anyone but Hermione, who recorded it in her notebook under a heading that had by then become its own small section, Confirmed Retreats. Watch for return. The rest of that first year passed in the ordinary rhythm of a school that had no idea anything extraordinary had happened beneath it. Julian, never having been told there was a stone to guard in the first place, spent the spring term enjoying a minor celebrity boost from a rumor that he'd somehow been involved in foiling whatever had gone on near the 3rd floor, a rumor nobody at the manor bothered correcting, since correcting it would have required explaining who actually deserved the credit. Quidditch took up a fair portion of that spring, in the loose, unserious way it did for first years not yet allowed their own brooms and matches. Julian, gifted one of the better training brooms money could buy, took to it with real enthusiasm and considerably more natural ease than he showed anywhere in a classroom. The one place, Harry noted, where his brother's confidence wasn't entirely borrowed. Harry flew well enough himself, competently and without any particular passion for it, content to let it remain one of the only arenas at Hogwarts where Julian's gifts were genuinely his own, and nobody needed quietly correcting on his behalf. "You could outfly him if you wanted to," Hermione observed once, watching from the stands as Julian executed a clean, showy loop above the practice pitch. "I know," Harry said. "I don't want to. Let him have this one. He's earned it honestly, which is more than I can say for most of what gets him applause." By the end of term, the two of them had settled into Hogwarts as completely as either of them was ever going to. Hermione near the top of every class she took, Harry quietly competent in all of them, and unremarkable on purpose. The two of them spending most evenings in a library that had, by then, become as familiar to them as the one back at the manor. The summer before second year passed quietly at the manor, mostly given over to a project Hermione had started the moment she'd finished cataloging the East Library properly, a private correspondence course of sorts, conducted by Owl, with two of the Muggle-born students from her year who'd struggled most with the transition into a world that assumed everyone already understood its unspoken rules. She never told them where the advice was coming from beyond a signed first name, and never asked for anything in return beyond the chance to be useful to people who reminded her, faintly, of the names crossed out in Lily's old notebook. "You're doing what she would have done," Harry said, watching her seal another letter at the kitchen table in August. "I know," Hermione said. "That's rather the point." Mrs. Norris was found rigid against a second-floor wall on the last evening of October, eyes fixed on nothing. Above her, letters too tall to have been written by hand declared that the Chamber of Secrets had been opened. By morning, half the school had a theory, and the easiest one needed no evidence at all. There was a Potter in the building, with a famous scar, and an unexplained gift for being near whatever happened. "They think it's Julian," Hermione said. "It's not about evidence," Harry said. "It's about which name is loudest in the room when something frightening happens." The whispering followed Julian through corridors for days, a low, constant undertone he had no real way to defend against. Because defending against a rumor with no clear author meant arguing with the entire school at once. His friends rallied around him loudly, which helped less than they thought it did. A famous boy surrounded by people insisting he couldn't possibly be the heir of Slytherin only made the suggestion feel more like something worth discussing rather than less. Harry watched this from a careful distance, with the same detachment he'd applied to most of his brother's troubles so far, until the cold sensation he'd learned to track reasserted itself one evening in a way that made detachment impossible to keep up. It was older than Quirrell's version, more patient, present in the lower corridors in a way that had nothing to do with rumor at all. "Something's been opened," he told Hermione. "Properly, not metaphorically." It took 3 weeks of unhurried research to find the shape of it, and Hermione spent more of those weeks frustrated than she usually allowed herself to be. The restricted sections' accounts of the chamber contradicted each other on nearly every detail that mattered, written, she suspected, by people more interested in moralizing about Slytherin's prejudices than in recording what had actually happened. She eventually found her clearest answer not in a history at all, but in a footnote inside an old Care of Magical Creatures text, describing, in clinical and unsentimental terms, the specific anatomy of a creature whose gaze could turn living things to stone. A detail none of the more dramatic accounts had bothered including, because clinical anatomy made for a far less satisfying legend than a monster did. "It's a basilisk," she told Harry, sliding the text across the table between them. "Which means whoever's controlling it has to be a speaker, the same as the legends always claimed about Slytherin himself. That part, at least, turns out to be true." Hermione traced the legend itself, Salazar Slytherin, a hidden chamber, a creature meant to purge the school of those he judged unworthy, cross-referencing 2 contradictory historical accounts, until she was confident the surviving stories had eroded the truth into something simpler and more sinister than what had actually happened 1,000 years earlier. Harry, meanwhile, followed the cold sensation itself, learning to read its intensity the way a tracker reads weather, narrowing its source not to a person at first, but to a place, and then, in the second week of November, to a person after all. Ginny Weasley had been quieter than usual since the start of term, a fact that registered with most of the school as nothing more than a younger sibling adjusting to a new year. Harry noticed it differently. The cold sensation didn't simply pass near her in corridors. It followed her, faint but constant, the way a held breath follows someone trying not to be noticed. "She has something," he told Hermione. "Not a presence riding her the way Quirrell carries one. Something she's carrying herself. An object." They watched for 3 more days before approaching her, long enough to confirm a pattern Hermione documented with her usual clinical patience. Ginny grew paler as the week went on, lost stretches of time she couldn't account for, flinched at any mention of a small black book that surfaced and disappeared from her bag without explanation. They found her alone after curfew in an unused classroom, having arranged the meeting through a note slipped to her at breakfast. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. The moment the door closed, her voice already braced for an answer she was afraid of. "No," Hermione said, gently, "but we think something dangerous has been happening to you, and we want to help before it gets worse." "How would you even know that?" I can sense the kind of magic involved, Harry said. It's old, and it's been near you for weeks. You have a diary. It writes back to you. You've been telling it things, and lately you've started losing time you can't explain. The color drained further out of an already pale face. I thought I was going mad, she admitted, handing over a worn black diary with hands that shook. I wake up places. I don't remember walking there. You're not going mad, Hermione said. Something's been using you. That's not the same thing, and it's not your fault. They took her to the hospital wing first, with an explanation simple enough to need no further justification, exposure to a cursed object, in need of rest, and then took the diary itself somewhere private, sealed with privacy charms Hermione had practiced specifically for occasions like this one. Destroying what was inside the diary took 3 careful attempts over several nights, against a presence that fought to hold its own shape. Throwing up images meant to break Harry's focus rather than any direct attack. His parents dying again, Hermione walking away mid-sentence, a future where everything they'd built simply collapsed. He held his attention on the working itself rather than the images, the way Sirius had taught him years earlier to hold a single thought steady against a flooded room. The first attempt failed after 90 seconds, the diary's resistance outlasting his focus. The second lasted twice as long before it cracked without breaking. The third finished what the first 2 had started. The diary went cold under his hands, the pages losing whatever faint warmth they'd carried, and the wrongness simply wasn't in the room anymore. 3 down, Hermione said quietly, recording the result in a notebook that had, by then, accumulated a private vocabulary neither of them shared with anyone else. How many more do you think there are? I don't know yet, Harry said, but I don't think this is the last one. But the compulsion the diary had already set in motion didn't stop the moment the book did. Harry traced its source, over several more days, to a second-floor bathroom rarely used by anyone but a weeping ghost named Myrtle, and a tap carved with a small snake that no plumber had ever installed. He spoke to it in a language that arrived in his mouth without explanation, low and hissing, entirely unlike anything that should come naturally to him. And the sink folded open onto a passage wide enough to swallow a person whole. I'm going in, he told Hermione, at the mouth of the pipe. Not alone. It can kill with a glance, Hermione. I'm the only one who can speak to it without that risk mattering. Nothing about this is safe regardless of who goes. I know, Harry said. That's why it has to be me. He went down alone, landing in a chamber built on a scale meant to humble whoever entered it, stone serpents carved along walls that vanished into shadow far overhead, the air colder here than anywhere else in the castle. He called out in the language that still felt borrowed rather than his own. I am Harry Potter. I seek the guardian of this chamber. The creature that answered was vast and ancient, eyes shut tight against a curse it had clearly learned to manage on its own terms over the centuries. Who dares enter the chamber of Salazar Slytherin? I do. I come not to destroy you. I come to offer you something nobody has offered you in 1,000 years. It was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that suggested genuine consideration rather than indifference. And what is that? Small speaker. Freedom. You've been bound here by compulsion carved into your own scales, forced to serve a dead man's intentions long after the man himself stopped mattering. I can break the binding if you let me. If you fail, I am compelled to kill you. If I fail, I will have deserved it. But I won't fail. It allowed him to approach, close enough that he could see the binding runes etched faintly along the ridges of its scales, 7 of them, ancient and precisely placed. It studied him with the strange patience of something that had had 1,000 years to learn what desperation looked like, and decided this was not that. You are different from the ones who came before you, it said. You do not fear me. You do not come to strike first. You ask. Because you're not a monster. You're a prisoner. There's a difference, even if nobody's bothered to notice it in a very long time. He found the keystone rune among the 7 and cast against it wandlessly, the way he'd practiced wandless precision for years in a manor library that had prepared him for exactly this kind of moment, without either of them knowing it at the time. The rune resisted once, flared, held. He cast again, steadier, and this time it cracked. What followed wasn't rage. It was something closer to 1,000 years of held breath finally released. A slow, shuddering exhale moving through its entire length, the compulsion unraveling from the inside until there was nothing left binding it to anyone's will but its own. Free, it said, and the word carried something almost like wonder. It studied him a long while after that. I am old, speaker. I have been awake far longer than anything should be. Now that the compulsion is gone, I find I have no wish to continue being awake at all. Harry understood what it was asking before it finished asking. He performed the passage carefully, with the same patience he'd brought to freeing it, and it lowered itself to the chamber floor, closed its eyes, and let go of a life it no longer had any reason to keep holding on to. He sat with it for a long while afterward, alone, in the cold and the dark, before climbing back toward the surface. The petrification stopped within days. The school credited the relief to luck and moved on, never once aware that the true heir of the chamber had walked into it, freed its oldest prisoner, and walked back out without anyone noticing he'd been gone. The school's resident defense professor that year, a vain, talkative man who had built an entire career out of stories considerably more impressive than his actual ability, organized a dueling club that winter, ostensibly to help students defend themselves while the corridors still felt unsafe. The demonstration he staged with Professor Snape went badly for him almost immediately, his own disarming spell flying wide and leaving him flat on his back in front of the assembled school, and the club he'd hoped would showcase his talents instead spent most of its first session showcasing how little of it there actually was. Julian, paired against an older Slytherin who'd clearly practiced more than his opponent, lost his footing within the first exchange and spent the rest of the session more embarrassed than instructed. Harry, paired against Hermione in a match neither of them had any intention of taking seriously, traded 3 textbook disarming spells back and forth with the kind of unhurried precision that made the surrounding students stop watching their own partners to watch instead. Neither of them won outright. Both of them understood, without needing to say so, that performing a draw was considerably safer than performing a victory in front of a room that already had one Potter's reputation to gossip about. "He's going to ask you to demonstrate something next week," Hermione murmured afterward, watching their professor recover his composure by loudly recounting an entirely different and more flattering version of what had just happened. "Don't." "I wasn't planning to," Harry said. "I'd rather he forget I was in the room at all." He mostly succeeded. By the 3rd week, the dueling club had quietly stopped meeting, its professor having decided, with visible relief, that the corridors were safe enough again to make further lessons unnecessary, a conclusion that had considerably more to do with his own bruised pride than with any actual change in the castle's safety. Professor Snape, who taught potions with a sharpness that frightened most students into silence and rewarded almost no one with open approval, was the only member of staff who seemed to watch Harry with anything resembling real attention rather than passing curiosity. He never said anything directly. He simply marked Harry's work with the same exacting, ungenerous precision he applied to everyone. And once, after a particularly difficult brewing exercise that Harry finished without consulting his textbook at all, lingered a moment longer than necessary at the workbench before moving on without comment. "He's noticed something," Hermione said afterward. "I don't know what, exactly, but he's noticed." "Let him notice," Harry said. "He's not the kind of man who goes looking for trouble that isn't already his to find. As long as we don't hand him a reason to look closer, I don't think he will." It proved, that year and the years that followed, to be the right read of the man. Snape's attention, considerable as it was, never extended past the workbench and the marks he gave for it, though Hermione kept a small, private note in her records all the same, on the principle that a man who noticed things and said nothing was worth remembering exactly because of how little he said. News reached the manor that summer that Peter Pettigrew had finally been sighted, 12 years after vanishing from the wreckage of his own betrayal, living quietly under a false name in a village 2 counties over, having spent over a decade convinced, wrongly, that nobody was still looking for him. The ministry's eventual arrest was almost anticlimactic compared to the years of searching that preceded it. He offered no resistance, and considerably less explanation than anyone had hoped for, claiming only that he'd been afraid, which nobody present found to be much of a defense for what his fear had cost 2 people who could no longer ask him to account for it. Sirius read the report 3 times before he said anything about it at all. 12 years, he said finally, to no one in particular. 12 years he got to simply disappear, and James and Lily didn't get even that. It doesn't undo anything, Harry said, watching him. But it closes something, doesn't it? It closes something, Sirius agreed. I'm not sure it closes enough to matter as much as I'd like it to. But it's more than I expected to get, this many years on. He set the report down and didn't bring it up again, though Harry noticed in the weeks that followed a particular tension in his shoulders easing that hadn't fully been there before. Remus Lupin arrived at Hogwarts that September to find Sirius waiting for him at the staff entrance. "There's something you need to see," Sirius said, "and I'd rather not say it standing in a doorway." What Sirius told him that evening rearranged 12 years of a story Remus had believed completely. The scar that landed on the wrong child by an accident of falling plaster. The decade inside a manor most of the wizarding world didn't know existed. Remus listened without interrupting, and when Sirius finally stopped talking, he sat for a long while in a silence that wasn't peaceful at all. "You've known since he was a baby," Remus said. "You let the rest of us mourn the wrong half of the story for 12 years. I had no proof that would hold against Dumbledore's certainty," Sirius said. "I made a decision. I'd make parts of it again, and other parts I'd do differently if I had the years back." Remus met Harry the next afternoon. Hermione came prepared, as always, with a folder already laid out before introductions had finished, the twin core theory, built from the closest documented analog she could find, sharing a single source material, and extrapolated onto living magical cores, then tested against years of direct observation. "You built an entirely new branch of theory," Remus said, at 14, because the existing literature didn't ask the right question. "It had a reason to ask it now," Hermione said, without any particular pride in the observation. "I went looking for an answer instead of waiting for someone else to provide one." Remus sat with the discomfort of being the least informed adult in the room, and found that the apology he owed both of them was easier to feel than to phrase. "I spent 12 years grieving a story that wasn't true," he said, "and never once thought to ask whether it might not be." "You weren't given a reason to ask," Harry said. "That's not an excuse for Dumbledore. It might be one for everyone else." "And for Dumbledore?" "He gets an explanation eventually when we're ready to give him one," Harry said. "Not an excuse." It took Remus longer than he expected to settle into the rhythm of the manor, longer still to stop flinching slightly every time Sirius said something that sounded exactly like the boy he remembered from school. Layered now under a decade of careful restraint neither of them had asked the other to perform. They spent an evening, not long after that first meeting, simply talking. About James. Mostly, the way old friends circle a grief by walking around its edges rather than through its center. "He'd have hated this," Remus said at one point, meaning the secrecy, the manner, the careful architecture of 2 children raised to be invisible. James never hid from anything in his life. James never had to, Sirius said. He got to be reckless because somebody else was always going to clean up after him eventually. I didn't have that luxury raising his son. I had to actually think about what happened next. Remus didn't argue the point, though something in his face suggested he was turning it over for longer than the conversation strictly required. He told Harry, a few weeks later, a story about a night the four of them, James, Sirius, a third friend who'd later betrayed all of them, and Remus himself, had spent an entire evening mapping every secret passage out of the castle, just to see if it could be done. "Your father would have loved watching you two work," he said. "He'd have hated not being in on it himself. He was never very good at being told to wait outside a door." "Sirius says the same thing," Harry said. "Usually right before he tells me to be more careful than my father ever was." "That part's true as well," Remus said. "Though I don't think either of us has any right to lecture you about caution, given what we got up to at your age." He stayed at the manor more often after that, teaching Harry and Hermione things neither Sirius nor any tutor had thought to cover. The specific, practical defensive magic of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had learned, the hard way, exactly which spells held up under real pressure and which only looked impressive in a classroom. Hermione filled an entire new section of her notebook with his lessons within the first month, headed simply Lupin Practical, distinct from everything she'd absorbed from theory texts alone. The letter that arrived for Julian that October didn't ask him for anything. It informed him, junior ambassador for Wizarding Youth Relations, public appearances, a goodwill tour. Julian said yes before he'd finished reading the second page. Hermione learned about the appointment before Julian's own house did, through a small, careful network of friends who mentioned things to her over breakfast. "They're not asking him to be an ambassador," she told Harry, laying out fragments of internal ministry memos. "They're asking him to be a banner they wave whenever a department needs better press. He has no idea, because nobody's ever taught him to ask why people want him in a room. The real danger," she argued, wasn't Julian's situation, it was precedent. If the ministry could quietly conscript one Potter as a mascot without consequence, nothing stopped them from eventually deciding the same logic applied to Harry. She found the fix in the Black family's older legal archives, a statute predating the ministry itself, granting any sitting head of an ancient house full independence from ministry oversight in matters of education and public representation, written into the original charter as a concession to the oldest families. Harry had never formally claimed the Potterheadship. Nobody outside the manor knew there was a second heir to claim it. They filed through Gringotts, deliberately, knowing the filing would carry procedural weight no ministry clerk could quietly misplace. By the time anyone at the ministry read the name attached to it, Harry James Potter was already, legally, head of the ancient house of Potter, fully emancipated under a law nobody had thought to repeal. The ministry's attempt to manage the discovery came as a hearing before Junior Undersecretary Dolores Umbridge, who opened by calling the claim highly irregular and expressing concern for the child's own protection. Umbridge ran the room the way she ran every room she'd ever been given even partial authority over, with a soft voice and a smile that never reached anything below her eyes, the specific manner of someone who had built an entire career out of making bureaucratic overreach sound like procedural concern. "For my protection," Harry repeated, without inflection. Naturally, a boy your age, claiming independence from guardianship without proper ministry oversight. Surely you understand our concern. Hermione slid a single page across the table. "The law doesn't require this office's approval. It requires blood legitimacy and proper filing, both of which Gringotts has already certified, with seal. This isn't a verification process. It's a courtesy, and courtesies can be withdrawn." Umbridge's expression didn't change, but something behind it tightened. "That's a rather serious accusation for a 14-year-old to make." "It's not an accusation," Hermione said. "It's a citation." When the ministry's lawyer tried a different angle, that emancipation required a demonstrated competence standard the ministry reserved the right to test, Harry answered plainly, the statute didn't require it, and adding such a requirement would need a full Wizengamot vote. More political capital than anyone in the room currently had appetite to spend on a 14-year-old who hadn't broken any law. The silence that followed carried the specific quality of two adults realizing, in real time, that the case they'd walked in expecting to win had already been lost before they finished their opening argument. The hearing ended 20 minutes after it began. Harry's status stood, unchallenged, entirely outside the reach of any future attempt to fold him into his brother's arrangement. Fudge himself heard about the outcome that evening, from Umbridge, framed as a minor procedural matter rather than the quiet defeat it actually was. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the second Potter boy might still be useful to the department in some lesser capacity. "I wouldn't recommend it, Minister," Umbridge said, in a tone that cost her something to produce. He came with his own legal counsel. A child his age, and she cited statute from memory faster than our man could find the page. Fudge considered this for a moment, decided it wasn't worth the political cost of pursuing further, and moved on to other business, never once realizing that the boy he'd briefly considered conscripting had just demonstrated more leverage over his own ministry than the department had managed to accumulate in over a decade of carefully managing his more famous brother. "That felt almost too easy," Harry said once they were clear of the building. "It was easy because we did the work before we walked in," Hermione said, "instead of after. That's the whole difference between winning and hoping." The first Hogsmeade weekend that autumn gave both of them something they'd never quite had before, an afternoon with no particular agenda attached to it. Sirius had signed the permission form for Harry without comment, the same casual scrawl he'd have used for anything else, and Hermione's parents had done the same for her from a Crawley kitchen table that had no idea what either signature actually authorized. They spent most of the afternoon in a bookshop neither of them had reason to visit twice, except that Hermione found 3 texts on warding theory she hadn't known existed and refused to leave until she'd at least skimmed all 3 standing in the aisle. Harry waited without complaint, the way he usually did, watching the village through the shop window. A strange, ordinary pleasure, seeing other students laughing over sweets and butterbeer with no idea that 2 of the people walking past them had spent the better part of a decade learning things most adults in this village would never need to know. "Do you ever wish it was simpler?" Hermione asked, eventually paying for her books. "Just this. No fragments, no ministry, no scar that isn't actually yours." "Sometimes," Harry admitted. "Not as often as you'd think. I don't know what I'd be doing with myself if it was simpler. Probably something considerably less interesting than this." "That's not really an answer. It's the honest one, though," he said. "I like the quiet days. I just don't think I'd know what to do with all of them at once." She didn't push further. She'd learned, over the years, when a question had reached the edge of what either of them was ready to say out loud, and she let this one settle without forcing it any further than it wanted to go. The Goblet of Fire arrived at Hogwarts in October of 1994, and Julian's name went in on the strength of his friend's encouragement rather than his own conviction. The school treated his selection as inevitability rather than gamble. Harry didn't enter through the goblet at all. A year earlier, Hermione's research into the Potter family's older bloodlines had surfaced a second claim entirely: descent from the House of Peverell, old enough to predate the Ministry, carrying a forgotten right of independent entry into the tournament separate from any school's selection process. "You're not competing as a Hogwarts champion," she explained. "You're competing as something the organizers haven't accounted for in centuries, and they can't disqualify you without contradicting their own founding charter." "Why would I want to compete at all?" Harry said. "I've spent years making sure attention lands anywhere but on me." Because Julian's about to face 4 tasks designed to be genuinely dangerous, surrounded by people who've spent his whole life clearing obstacles instead of teaching him to clear them himself. Someone needs to be in there who can account for what happens to him if the obstacles don't bend the way they always have. The selection ceremony produced 3 names cleanly from the goblet's flame: Cedric Diggory, Fleur Delacour, Victor Krum, before officials announced a 4th competitor through a separate channel entirely: Harry Potter, head of the ancient house of Peverell, entering under hereditary right. Julian's face went through several expressions before settling on something that had nowhere in particular to aim itself: "There's two of us," he said to the nearest friend. "Since when has there been two of us?" The whispering that followed lasted considerably longer than the whispering after the chamber had reopened 2 years earlier. Because this time there was no rumor to debunk, the second name was simply, undeniably real. Announced by the tournament's own officials in front of the entire assembled school, and two visiting delegations who had no prior context for any of it. Fleur Delacour, watching the confusion ripple through the great hall with the detached interest of someone who'd already decided none of it concerned her competitively, remarked to a fellow Beaubaton student that the English seemed to enjoy complicating their own tournaments unnecessarily. Victor Krum, characteristically, said nothing at all and simply added Harry's name to the short list of competitors he intended to take seriously, having watched him cross the hall once and decided, on no more evidence than that the quiet ones were usually the ones worth watching closely. Cedric Diggory, to his credit, was the only one of the 3 goblet champions who sought Harry out directly that first week, finding him in a quiet corner of the library and introducing himself properly, as though a fourth, unexpected competitor deserved exactly the same courtesy as the other 3. "Strange way to enter a tournament," he said. "Not unkindly." "Older right," the announcement said. "Older than the tournament itself, apparently," Harry said. "I didn't enter to win. I entered because I didn't trust the maze to be kind to the people in it." Cedric considered that for a moment, the way a naturally decent person considers most things, slowly and without suspicion. "That's either the strangest or the most sensible reason anyone's given me all week," he said, and left it there, which Harry appreciated more than he said. The gap between 3 years of genuine preparation and 3 years of borrowed confidence showed in every task that followed, not through anything dramatic, but through quiet, repeated contrast. The dragon task came first. On a cold morning in late November, 4 arenas built into the grounds for spectacle as much as danger, each champion given a different breed to face alone. Julian arrived with a plan whispered to him the night before by a friend whose older brother worked in the ministry's containment division, sound enough in theory, poorly executed in practice. He summoned his broom as instructed, but hesitated a full 3 seconds longer than the maneuver allowed for, and the dragon's tail caught his shoulder hard enough to send him into the arena wall before he managed to claim the egg at all. He limped away with the prize, and a story his friends immediately began reshaping into something more heroic than what the watching crowd had actually seen. Harry faced his dragon having spent the preceding week not searching for a clever trick, but methodically studying the specific breed assigned to him, Cross, referencing its territorial instincts against a calming charm he and Sirius had refined years earlier for an entirely different purpose. He didn't outrun the dragon or distract it with theatrics. He simply walked the perimeter of its territory slowly enough that it stopped registering him as a threat worth pursuing, retrieved the egg from beneath its claws while it dozed in the afternoon sun, and walked back out at the same unhurried pace he'd walked in with. The crowd, expecting spectacle, got something closer to anticlimax, and Hermione, watching from the stands with her notebook already open, recorded the exact duration of the approach with visible satisfaction. The second task, set in the depths of the lake, asked each champion to retrieve something taken from them, held by merfolk in the cold dark below the surface. Julian received a vial of gillyweed from a professor sympathetic to his reputation, swallowed it without understanding the dosage properly, and spent the bulk of his underwater hour disoriented by an effect stronger than intended, nearly missing the time limit before a pair of merfolk, growing impatient, simply handed him what he'd come for, rather than make him search any longer. Harry and Hermione had spent the preceding month developing something neither borrowed nor improvised, a sustained underwater breathing charm adapted from an old runic working in the Peverell family texts, tested repeatedly in the Manor's Lake under Sirius's careful supervision, until Harry could maintain it without conscious effort. He descended calmly, located what had been taken from him with a tracking method Hermione devised from the same theoretical framework she'd been refining since the diary, and surfaced with 11 minutes to spare, having needed no assistance from anyone holding the test. The third task, the maze, was where the gap closed into something that actually mattered. The Yule Ball, held in December as tradition demanded, gave the school one evening that had nothing to do with dragons or eggs or scoring. Julian arrived with a date chosen mostly for the photographs the arrangement would generate, smiling the particular smile he'd learned to produce for cameras, whether or not anything underneath it matched. Harry went without much expectation of enjoying himself, and found to his mild surprise that he did anyway. Hermione had spent weeks insisting she had no interest in the event at all, and then appeared on the night of it in deep blue robes that made at least 3 separate students forget, briefly, that she'd ever been merely the clever Ravenclaw girl who corrected professors. "You look surprised," she said, catching his expression. "I am," Harry admitted. "Not by the dress. By how little it matters that I'm bad at this. You're not bad at it. You're cautious about it. Those aren't the same thing." She held out a hand anyway, the offer made plainly, without performance the way she made most offers. "Try anyway. Nobody here is keeping score of how well you dance. That's the entire point of tonight." He wasn't, in fact, very good at it, and didn't improve much over the course of the evening, and found he minded less than he expected to. It was, he thought later, one of the few hours that whole year that had belonged to absolutely nothing except itself. No fragment to track, no ministry to outmaneuver. No brother's reputation quietly subsidized in the background. Just an ordinary evening, spent with someone who'd spent years being the only person who understood exactly what he was carrying, finally getting to set it down for a few hours and simply exist beside her instead. Across the hall, Julian's evening went considerably less well. His date, midway through the night, asked him directly whether the rumors about a second Potter heir entering the tournament under some forgotten law were true, and watched his face carefully while he answered, the way people had started watching him that whole autumn, less for who he was than for what he might confirm. He gave an answer that wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either, and felt, for the first time, the specific loneliness of being asked about a thing he genuinely didn't understand by someone who assumed he did. He found Harry near the edge of the hall, sometime after midnight, both of them stepping out for air at almost the same moment. "Is it true?" Julian asked, without preamble. "The thing they're saying, about the older claim." "It's true," Harry said. There seemed no point by then in being anything other than plain about it. Julian absorbed that for a long moment, the cold night air doing more to steady him than any answer could have. "I don't understand any of this," he said finally. "I don't understand why nobody told me, or why you didn't, or what I'm even supposed to do with knowing it now." "You're not supposed to do anything with it tonight," Harry said. "Tonight you're supposed to go back in and finish the dance you were having before you came out here looking for answers I can't fully give you yet. The rest can wait until there's actually time to do it properly." It wasn't comfort, exactly, but Julian went back inside anyway, and didn't ask again that night, and Harry stood alone in the cold for a few minutes afterward, turning over how much longer the careful architecture he and Hermione had built could keep holding before something inside it finally had to give. 20 minutes in, cornered by a creature placed deeper in the maze than any previous champion had reached this early, Julian froze. The spell he reached for had been practiced exactly twice, both times with someone else's hand steadying his own, and it failed the way undertrained magic fails under real pressure. Harry felt the danger flare sharply enough to stop him mid-stride in a separate section of the maze. Not Voldemort's presence directly, but something close enough to it that he'd learned, over years, to take seriously. He didn't think about whether helping fit anywhere into the careful architecture he and Hermione had built around staying unseen. He simply moved, and reached the clearing in time to disrupt the creature's focus just long enough for Julian to scramble back out of range. By the time Julian looked up, there was no one else there. Harry reached the center of the maze himself less than 10 minutes later and found the cup waiting. He stood over it for a long moment and didn't take it. Taking it meant becoming, publicly, the second Potter the wizarding world would have to account for, on the tournament's terms instead of his own. He turned and walked back out, letting the clock run down around him until officials, confused by the gap, eventually declared Julian champion by elimination, the last competitor still inside the maze when time expired. The cup that should have ended the tournament cleanly carried one final complication, a portkey hidden inside it, keyed by a hand that was never supposed to have access to it at all. Julian touched it during the closing ceremony and was gone before anyone in the hall registered that something had gone wrong with the evening's choreography. He landed hard in a graveyard he had never seen, with the particular clarity terror sometimes grants that he had not been brought there to leave again. Harry felt it from across the grounds before any announcement was made, the wrongness he'd spent years learning to read flaring sharply enough to nearly drop him where he stood, pulling not toward Julian but toward the thing that had been hunting both of them since before either could walk. "He's gone," Harry told Hermione, finding her in the chaos already spreading through the hall. Taken, the portkey was in the cup. Sirius reached the manor's old apparition point within minutes of being summoned, and the three of them followed the same pull Harry had been tracking, arriving in the graveyard not far behind the portkey itself, late enough that the worst had already begun, early enough that it hadn't finished. A ritual had completed in a small fire-lit clearing by the time they reached it. Black smoke curled off the surface of a cauldron taller than a man, moving with something closer to intention than wind. What rose from it was thinner and paler than the old photographs, a body still learning the weight of itself, robes settling over a frame that hadn't finished deciding how to stand. The eyes that opened were a deep, depthless red, and they fixed immediately on the bound boy a short distance away. "Harry Potter," the figure said. "At last." He pressed 2 fingers to the scar above Julian's left eye, searching for a resonance that should have answered his own soul the way a struck bell answers a struck bell. Nothing answered. "This is wrong," he said, quietly, to himself. "This isn't where it should be." It was at that exact moment that Harry, Hermione, and Sirius reached the clearing's edge, and whatever remained in Voldemort recognized, instantly and from a distance, the part of itself it had been separated from 13 years earlier. The understanding that crossed his reconstructed face was not triumph. It was fear. "That's not possible," he said, turning, his voice rising for the first time. "I felt it leave my body that night. I felt it land. It landed on the boy with the scar. It landed where the curse tore through first," Hermione said, stepping forward with a steadiness she'd built for years, specifically for moments like this one, not where the scar happened to form afterward. "You spent 13 years hunting a mark on the flesh, when the only mark that ever mattered was on the soul, and nobody, not you, not Dumbledore, not anyone in this entire war, ever checked whether the two actually matched." For several seconds his composure simply failed to hold. He looked between Julian, shaking against the headstone, and Harry, standing calmly at the clearing's edge with the missing piece of himself answering his presence across the distance between them. And the horror that settled into his face had nothing to do with physical danger. It was the horror of recalculation, 13 years of strategy, built entirely around the same single error Dumbledore had made in a nursery. An error Voldemort had shared without ever questioning it. "You've been planning around the wrong child," Harry said quietly. "The same mistake everyone else made. You just had less excuse because you were actually there." "Then I will simply correct it," Voldemort said, recovering some of his composure, raising his wand toward Harry instead. "The boy who carries it dies either way. The name on the headline was never the part that mattered to me." "You died once already," Harry said. "You just haven't finished noticing." The confrontation that followed was brief, and not the contest of equally matched power any legend would eventually want it to be. When the killing curse came, fast and certain, Harry didn't meet it with a curse of his own. He met it with an old working built around an idea that had nothing to do with offense. The idea of a soul too torn and too long delayed to keep refusing a door it had spent decades avoiding. Hermione's research over the preceding months had confirmed what the working would need. The fragment that had once ridden inside Quirrell had, by then, found its way back to the body now standing in this clearing, drawn home the way scattered things are eventually drawn home when there's nowhere else left for them to go. Whatever remained of Voldemort, in other words, was finally, entirely, standing in front of them, not split across some unknown number of distant anchors, but gathered, for the first time since 1981, into a single point. The curse simply stopped mattering a foot from Harry's chest. What happened to Voldemort instead wasn't destruction so much as a door opening at last, on its own terms rather than his newly reconstructed body going still. Then losing its edges entirely, the wrongness Harry had tracked for years finally, completely gone from a world it was never meant to keep standing in. "No," Voldemort said, the words smaller than anything he'd allowed himself in decades. "I am eternal." He didn't finish the sentence. There was no rebound, no rubble, no scar left behind to misread. Only the sound of something long overdue finally arriving, and then nothing where a man who'd called himself eternal had been standing a moment before. The servant who'd fled the cauldron's edge didn't get far. Sirius caught him before he cleared the graveyard's boundary, and the man, frightened, talkative, eager to trade information for leniency, the moment he understood his master was actually, finally gone, gave Ministry investigators more in his first hour of questioning than a decade of prior intelligence work had managed. By the time the first response team from the Ministry arrived, summoned by a charm Hermione had triggered the moment they'd confirmed where the portkey had taken them, there was a bound, frightened man waiting to be questioned, a shaking Julian wrapped in Sirius's traveling cloak, and no trace at all of the thing that had brought them all to this graveyard in the first place. The senior Auror who took charge of the scene spent a long, careful while simply standing at its center, turning slowly, trying to reconcile what the wreckage suggested with what the four witnesses were telling him had happened. He looked at Harry, calm, unmarked, standing where a resurrected dark wizard had stood minutes before, for considerably longer than he looked at anyone else present. "You're saying he's gone," the Auror said. "Properly gone. Not retreated, not weakened." "Gone. I'm saying it," Harry said. "I'd rather you verify it than take my word for it, though. That's what the rest of tonight is for." It took the Department of Magical Law Enforcement the better part of a week, and considerably more paperwork than anyone present that night would have predicted, to confirm what four witnesses had already told them plainly, that whatever had returned in that graveyard had not survived the encounter, and that no trace of it could be located anywhere a trained sweep was capable of looking. Julian was quiet for a long while. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to Sirius. "You knew," he said, looking at Harry. "This whole time. There's been two of us, and you knew, and nobody told me. I found out the same way you're finding out now," Harry said, slowly and too late to change how the first years went. "I'm sorry for that part. I'm not sorry I spent those years getting ready for tonight instead of getting photographed for it." The walk back through the Manor's apparition point that night was quiet, in a way none of them tried to fill with conversation. Sirius carried Julian most of the way, despite Julian's weak protests that he could walk fine on his own, and Hermione walked half a step behind Harry the entire distance, close enough that her shoulder brushed his more than once without either of them remarking on it. Nobody spoke about what had happened in the clearing until they were well clear of it, and even then, only briefly, there would be time, in the days ahead, for the fuller reckoning. That night called for nothing more complicated than getting everyone home in one piece. The Daily Prophet ran the story within 48 hours, and it did not run the version anyone at the Ministry would have chosen, given the choice. Too many witnesses had stood in that graveyard. It did not happen all at once for Julian. It happened in the small, accumulating ways fame curdles when its foundation gives out. A friend who stopped sitting beside him at meals without quite explaining why. A professor who corrected his name in front of the class, with more care than usual, as though apologizing for something nobody had found the right words for yet. The entourage that surrounded him for 3 years thinned gradually, not through any single dramatic break, but through the quiet, almost embarrassed withdrawal of people who realized they'd never actually been friends with a boy. They had been friends with a headline, and the headline had just been corrected. He found Harry in the library 3 weeks later, the first time he'd sought him out directly since the graveyard. "I don't know who I am if I'm not him," he said. No preamble. "You're still you," Harry said. "You just stopped being a story about someone else's mistake. That's easy for you to say. You've had years of knowing who you actually are. I've had years of being told. I had years of nobody clapping for me," Harry said, and it wasn't said unkindly, just plainly, the way he said most things. "You had years of everyone clapping for someone who wasn't really there. I'm not sure which one of us got the better deal, honestly. I just know which one I'd choose again if someone made me pick." Julian looked down at his own hands, turning them over, as if checking whether they belonged to the version of himself everyone had known for years, or to whoever was left now that the version had been quietly retired by a headline he hadn't written and hadn't asked for. "I tried to levitate an owl on the train. First year," he said, finally, the admission arriving sideways, the way true things often do when a person isn't ready to say the larger truth they're actually circling. "Everyone said I'd done brilliantly anyway. I knew I hadn't. I just never said anything, because saying something would have meant giving up the only thing I had." "I know," Harry said. "I was 3 carriages back. I fixed the owl before it hurt itself worse." He said it without any particular weight, the way he'd said versions of this for years, and watched it land on Julian with considerably more weight than he'd intended. "How many times?" Julian asked. "How many times did you fix something and let me think I'd done it myself?" "I don't know. I stopped counting. That's worse. Somehow I thought I was good at things. I thought the magic actually liked me." His voice caught on the last sentence, the particular grief of a person realizing that an entire identity had been resting on borrowed ground for years without his knowledge. "You are good at things," Harry said. "Just not the things everyone decided to praise you for. I watched you talk that first year out of panicking on the platform, the one who couldn't find his trunk. Nobody photographed that. It mattered more than the owl ever did. It wasn't enough to fix what was broken. Harry didn't expect it to be, and didn't pretend otherwise. But it was the first conversation either of them had had that wasn't performance on one side and quiet correction on the other. And something in the room settled slightly differently by the time Julian finally stood to leave. The real test of what was left of him arrived 2 weeks later, not in a quiet library conversation, but in a corridor, fast and unplanned. The way real tests of character almost always arrive. A group of younger students, second years, none of them old enough to have built any particular opinion of either Potter brother beyond what the paper had told them, were cornered near a stairwell by a trio of older students who had decided, in the specific cruel logic of teenagers testing new social hierarchies, that mocking the family connected to this month's scandal was good sport. One of the second years, clutching a half-finished herbology assignment, was close to tears by the time Julian rounded the corner and saw what was happening. He had, by every measure that mattered 3 weeks ago, no reason to intervene. The fame that once made intervention easy, the assumed authority of being someone people instinctively deferred to, had mostly evaporated along with the headline that built it. What was left was just a 4th-year boy, recently humbled in front of the entire wizarding world, with no particular standing left to throw around. He intervened anyway. "Leave them alone," he said, stepping between the older students and the cornered second years, and his voice didn't carry the easy confidence it used to. It carried something closer to nerves, visible and unhidden, the sound of someone doing a hard thing without the armor he used to do everything behind. "Or what, Potter?" the lead student said, with the specific contempt reserved for someone who'd recently fallen from a height. "What exactly are you going to do about it now?" Julian didn't have a brilliant spell ready. What he had was a basic shielding charm, practiced properly for the first time in his life over the preceding weeks, taught to him not by Harry but by a fellow student who'd taken pity on him after the graveyard story broke and offered, quietly, to actually teach him something instead of just admiring him. He cast it, correctly, between the second years and the raised wand opposite him. And it held, not spectacularly, not the way Harry's workings held, but solidly, the unglamorous, hard-earned solidity of someone who'd actually practiced. "I'm not as good as my brother Julian," said, holding the shield, his voice steadier now that he was doing something rather than explaining himself. "I know that now. I spent 3 years not knowing it. And that's on the people who let me believe otherwise, as much as it's on me. But I'm standing here, and you're not getting past me to a bunch of second years who haven't done anything to deserve this." Word of it reached Harry by dinner, relayed by one of the rescued second years with the breathless exaggeration children sometimes apply to a genuine kindness witnessed firsthand. "He held a shield charm properly," Harry said, turning it over. "First real one I've heard of him casting without help. Does that surprise you?" Hermione asked. "No," Harry said, after a moment. "I think it's the first time he's ever cast anything for a reason that wasn't about being watched. It was not redemption, not in any complete sense. And neither Harry nor Hermione was interested in pretending it was. Julian had years of unlearned habits ahead of him, a reputation in pieces, friendships that had revealed themselves as conditional the moment the headline that built them stopped being convenient to stand beside. But it was, Harry thought, watching his brother eat dinner 3 tables away in a hall considerably quieter around him than it used to be. The first genuine thing Julian had done since this entire story began. A small, unglamorous act of decency, performed by someone who finally had nothing left to gain from performing it. The war did not end cleanly, the way wars and stories sometimes pretend to. It ended in pieces, scattered across the following months, each piece smaller than the graveyard but no less necessary, because a dark wizard's death does not automatically empty the world of people who'd built their lives around serving him. The followers who'd scattered from that clearing regrouped twice over the following months, each time with less coherence than the time before. The way a body keeps moving for a moment after the signal that animates it has already stopped arriving. The first regrouping attempted a strike against a ministry archive in early summer, hoping to recover records that might help them locate other believers. It ended with 3 arrests and no casualties, largely because Sirius had anticipated the target a full day in advance and arranged for the archive to be quietly emptied of anything worth stealing before they arrived. The second, smaller and more desperate, tried to make an example of a Muggle-born family Voldemort's followers had marked years earlier and never gotten around to threatening. Sirius reached the house first, having read the pattern of old grudges the way he'd learned to read most things that year, and the family never knew how close the danger had actually come. Sirius, restored fully now to a public life he'd spent over a decade locked out of, led the response to both regroupings with a steadiness that surprised even himself, not the reckless young man who once rode a motorbike into a burning night, but someone who'd had years, however strange and hidden, to learn the difference between courage and recklessness. Remus stood beside him for both, the two of them falling into an old, easy coordination that neither had used in over a decade, and that came back, when it mattered, faster than either expected. Harry and Hermione did not lead the fighting directly, not in the way the histories would eventually want to remember it. Their part was quieter, the way their part had always been quieter. Hermione tracing the last scattered followers through financial and familial records the ministry's own investigators hadn't thought to examine. Harry occasionally called on when the cold sensation flared against something the rest of the Order couldn't see coming. By midsummer, the last meaningful resistance had folded, not through a single dramatic battle, but through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of correct decisions made early enough to matter. The final confrontation that did occur, a small group of remaining believers, the last true followers clinging to a cause whose leader no longer existed to lead it, turned on the same theoretical groundwork Hermione had spent months refining since the graveyard. When their last desperate working tried to draw on a blood-bound ritual meant to call back some echo of their fallen leader, it was Hermione's modified containment ward, built directly from her research into the way fractured magical signatures behave under stress, that closed around the working before it could complete, smothering it the way a hand closes around a candle flame. "That's the last of it," she said afterward, standing in the wreckage of the safe house while ministry officials processed the handful of captured followers, whatever they were hoping to call back. "It's gone now in a way it wasn't gone in the graveyard. You're sure? I built the ward around the specific signature he carried. If anything of him remained to answer it, it would have answered. Nothing did." She closed her notebook, the same battered, expanded system she'd carried since she was 7 years old, organizing a manor library nobody had touched in decades. "It's over, Harry. Properly this time." Ginny Weasley sent Harry a letter that summer, the first either of them had exchanged since the diary, short and a little awkward in the way letters are when neither person quite knows how much to say. "I heard about the graveyard," she wrote. "I'm glad you're all right. I think I understand now, a little better than I did at 11, what it's like to carry something that isn't yours and have everyone get the story wrong anyway." Harry wrote back, just as briefly, that he was glad she was doing well, and that some things were easier to carry once somebody else finally said them out loud. Neither of them turned it into more correspondence than that, but Harry kept the letter, tucked into the same drawer where Sirius had once kept an old newspaper clipping. September arrived quieter than either of them had expected a war's ending to feel. Julian, having spent the summer rebuilding something honest out of the wreckage of who he used to perform being, returned to Hogwarts for his 5th year without an entourage, and without much interest in acquiring one. He sat with the few friends who'd stayed, fewer in number, considerably more genuine in substance, and spent more time than he ever used to actually practicing the magic he'd only recently started learning properly. The unglamorous, repetitive work nobody applauds because nobody's watching anymore. He and Harry did not become close in the way storybooks might want them to. There was too much history between them for that. Too many years of one boy's truth quietly subsidizing the other boy's myth. But something steadier than closeness grew in its place. An understanding, careful and unhurried, built across small moments rather than one grand reconciliation. They ate dinner together sometimes. Julian asked, occasionally, for help with a spell he was struggling with, and Harry gave it plainly, without performance, the same way he'd always given help to anyone who actually wanted it rather than wanted credit for needing it. "I used to think being him meant something," Julian said once, late in the autumn term, the two of them walking back from the library together. An arrangement that had become quietly regular without either of them naming it as such. "Now I think the only thing that ever meant something was what I actually did with my own hands." "Took me long enough to work that out." "Most people never work it out at all," Harry said. "You got there before 20. That's not nothing." Dumbledore, for his part, spent the months after the graveyard in a kind of careful, deliberate reckoning that Harry watched from a distance without much interest in hurrying along. The old wizard did not seek absolution. Exactly, he seemed to understand, finally, that absolution wasn't really his to ask for from a boy whose first years he'd shaped through an error he'd never once thought to verify. What he did instead was smaller and, in its own way, harder. He began quietly correcting the institutional weight of his own mistake. Restructuring how the school identified and supported students rather than relying on reputation and assumption, citing, without ever naming his sources directly, lessons learned from a case he described, in private correspondence with the Wizengamot's Education Committee, only as an error in identification with consequences he should have anticipated and had not. He found Harry alone by the lake one evening in late October, the two of them watching the last of the autumn light fail over the water. "I built years of strategy on the first photograph instead of the facts," Dumbledore said, without preamble, the kind of sentence that had clearly been rehearsed many times before it was finally spoken aloud. "Because being certain felt easier. in that moment than being right. I have had a long time to sit with what that cost you, and what it cost your brother, and I find I do not have a satisfying way to apologize for either. You don't need a satisfying way, Harry said. You just need to keep not making the same mistake. That's worth more than an apology would be. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, watching the water. Your mother kept notes, he said eventually, on children like Miss Granger. I read through some of what Sirius shared with me when this all finally came to light. She believed, I think, that the system itself was the failure, not any single mistake within it, but a structure that only ever notices a child once that child has already proven exceptional in some visible way. He glanced at Harry. I think she would have approved of what the two of you have built. I think she would also have asked, eventually, why it had to be built quietly, in the dark, by two children who shouldn't have had to do any of it alone. Maybe, Harry said. But we weren't alone. That's the part most people miss when they imagine how this happened. By the time the 7th year arrived, the school had changed in ways too gradual for most of its students to notice happening in real time. Students entering now were identified earlier. Through a quiet program Hermione had helped design and Dumbledore implemented without ever attaching her name to it publicly, at her own insistence, she had never needed the credit. Only the outcome. The program worked, in practice much the way Lily's old notebook had worked 20 years earlier, except formalized, a small network of trained witches and wizards, quietly placed near Muggle communities, watching for the same signs Lily had once noticed by accident in a dentist's waiting room. Letters arrived earlier for the children the program found, with gentler explanations, and fewer of those children spent their first year at Hogwarts as lost as Hermione herself might have been without a tutor who'd simply decided, 9 years earlier, that she was worth the trouble of finding properly. The old, rigid sorting of students by background had begun, slowly, to lose some of its institutional teeth, not through grand legislation, but through the patient, unglamorous work of people who understood that real change rarely announces itself with fanfare. Harry graduated that June, 17 years old, having spent the bulk of his adolescence solving problems most adults never knew existed, and felt, standing in the Great Hall for the final ceremony, something he hadn't quite had words for until this exact evening. Not triumph, not relief, but a kind of settled quiet, the specific peace of someone who'd built what needed building and was finally allowed to simply exist alongside it rather than constantly maintaining it. Hermione stood beside him at the ceremony, having already received 3 separate offers from different departments eager to hire the witch whose theoretical work quietly underpinned half the defensive innovations of the last several years, none of which she'd accepted yet, because she was still deciding which kind of work would let her keep solving the problems that actually mattered rather than the ones that simply paid well. Julian graduated the same evening, a year behind where his fame once suggested he'd be celebrated, considerably further ahead than anyone 3 years ago would have predicted in terms of who he'd actually become. He sat with his small, genuine circle of friends, applauded for Harry's name when it was called the way anyone applauds for someone they've actually come to know rather than simply admired from a distance, and found, somewhere in that applause, that the gap between the two brothers had narrowed into something that finally resembled an ordinary family rather than a story anyone needed to keep correcting. Sirius, watching from the gathered crowd of parents and guardians, caught Harry's eye across the hall the moment his name was called, and the look that passed between them carried years of a promise quietly kept. A boy raised in a house with no audience, given time instead of attention, and grown, in the end, into exactly the kind of person that time was always meant to produce. Sirius himself, in the years that followed, did something he'd never quite let himself imagine doing. While either child still needed him at the manor full-time, he let the house grow a little louder. He repaired the old training yard the following summer, not for lessons this time, but for nothing in particular, and started inviting people over for the kind of evenings James would have organized constantly, and Sirius had spent over a decade too cautious to risk. Remus came often, Hermione's parents came twice a year, gamely, even after the chess games stopped being close. Sirius never remarried, never seemed to feel the absence of it especially keenly, and told Harry once, plainly, that raising him and Hermione both had been the only kind of family he'd ever actually wanted, the rest having simply arrived as a pleasant surprise around the edges of that decision. "You could have had your own life," Harry told him once, not long after graduation, "instead of spending it all on us." "I did have my own life," Sirius said. "This was it. I don't know why everyone assumes raising the two of you was some sort of sacrifice. It was the first thing in years that made any sense to me at all." Harry did not seek out further power once the ceremony ended. He had held more of it, in practice, than most adults in the wizarding world ever would, and had learned, across years of careful work, that the only part of it worth keeping was the part spent quietly making things better for people who never knew his name was attached to the improvement. He took a position within the Department of Magical Education the following autumn, working alongside Hermione on the reforms she'd already begun drafting, neither of them interested in titles. Both of them interested in the same patient, unglamorous work that had built everything they'd accomplished so far. Julian, for his part, found something he'd never had before, an ordinary life, chosen rather than assigned, built around the small, honest competencies he'd spent the last several years actually earning rather than performing. He was not famous anymore, not in the way the world had once insisted he be. He discovered slowly that this suited him considerably better than fame ever did. He took up work eventually with a small magical menagerie outside London, something quiet and hands-on that nobody photographed, and found he preferred it that way. Neville Longbottom, who had spent 7 years as one of the only people at Hogwarts who'd never once treated Harry as anything other than a friend, who occasionally helped find a missing toad, came to visit the manor that first autumn after graduation. Awkward and pleased in equal measure at being invited somewhere so clearly important to two people he'd always assumed thought of him as incidental. "I always wondered why you never seemed bothered by any of it," he admitted, over tea in the same kitchen, where so much else had been decided over the years. "The whole business with your brother. Everyone else at school treated it like the most interesting thing that had ever happened. You just never seemed to need it to be interesting." "You never asked me to be interesting," Harry said. "You just wanted help with Trevor. That mattered more than you probably realize." Neville considered that for a long moment, the particular slow consideration of someone unused to being told his ordinary kindness had counted for something. "I'm glad I never worked out there was a story to ask about, then," he said finally. "I rather like having been the one person who didn't." Hermione's parents made the trip up from Crawley not long after, the first time either of them had properly seen the inside of the manor that had quietly shaped most of their daughter's adult life. Mr. Granger spent a long while standing in the East Library, turning slowly on the spot, taking in 3 centuries of shelving his daughter had once described, at age 7, as something that was going to take her a while to sort. "You did all this," he said to her, not quite a question. "Most of it," Hermione said. "Sirius helped." Harry helped eventually, once he stopped being intimidated by alphabetical order. She smiled at the memory, the kind of small private smile she rarely let show in front of anyone but the two of them. "I think I always knew I'd end up doing something like this. I just didn't know it would matter quite this much." Her mother, quieter than her husband, simply put a hand on her daughter's shoulder and said nothing for a while, which Hermione understood, better than most words could have managed, as its own complete sentence. On a quiet evening the following spring, the 3 of them, Harry, Hermione, and Julian, sat together at the kitchen table in Potter Manor, the same table where Sirius had once explained to a 9-year-old that there were 2 kinds of marks. "Do you ever think about how different this would have looked?" Julian asked, "if the ceiling hadn't cracked that exact way, that exact night?" "Sometimes," Harry said. "Not as often as you'd think. Why not?" "Because it doesn't change anything to wonder about it. We didn't get chosen by a prophecy or a scar or anything else everyone spent over a decade arguing over. We just decided, eventually, what to do with whatever we'd actually been given. That's the part that was always ours to choose. Julian turned his cup slowly between his hands, the way he'd taken to doing whenever a conversation reached the edges of something he was still learning to sit with comfortably. I think about it more than I'd like to admit, he said. Not with bitterness, particularly, just wondering what I'd have been if the story had landed on you the way everyone thought it had, and I'd had the years you got instead. You'd have built something, Hermione said simply. Maybe not the same thing. But you've shown us, these last few years, that you're capable of building things honestly when nobody's handing them to you. That was never really in question. It just took longer to surface than it should have, because everyone around you kept answering questions you hadn't actually asked yet. That's a kinder read of it than I usually give myself. It's the accurate one, she said. I don't deal much in the kind. Julian laughed at that. Properly, the sound easier than it would have been even a year earlier. No, he agreed, you really don't. Harry looked between his brother and the woman who'd spent years building, alongside him, a kind of quiet, deliberate architecture that the wizarding world was only now beginning to fully understand it had been standing on. The rest was just an accident in a nursery, he said. This part, here, was the part we built on purpose. Outside, the evening settled gently over the grounds of a house that had spent 30 years waiting for someone to live in it properly, and finally had. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.